The stage felt like a whole different world, a giant, bright planet where she was the only person living. 7-year-old Angelica stood right in the middle of it, her small shoes feeling sticky on the polished wooden floor. Above her, lights as big as car tires blazed down, so hot she could feel them warming the top of her head. They were incredibly bright, too. When she looked past the edge of the stage, all she could see was a huge, dark space filled with tiny, blurry specks of light. She knew those specks were people, hundreds and hundreds of them, all sitting quietly and waiting for her to do something. The silence was the loudest thing she had ever heard. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, waiting silence that pressed down on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. In front of her, a long table stretched across the stage. 3 people sat behind it, their faces serious under their own smaller, softer lights. These were the judges. They were the most important people in this world, the ones who held the power to make dreams come true or to crush them into little pieces. The judge in the middle was a man with a very neat suit and a tired look on his face. He had seen so many singers, so many dancers, so many people with big hopes, that it was hard to surprise him anymore. He leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen on his notepad, looking like he was already thinking about what he was going to have for dinner. The lady judge next to him gave Angelica a small, kind smile, but it looked a little bit tired, too. The third judge was just staring into space, looking bored. Angelica's heart started to beat a little faster, like a tiny drum trying to warn her of something. She clutched the big, silver microphone with both of her hands. It was cold and heavy, much heavier than the one she practiced with at home. Her knuckles were white, and she was holding it so tight that her hands were starting to feel shaky. A bright pink bow, the one her mother had put in her hair that morning, felt like it was weighing her down. It was her favorite bow, but right now it just felt like another pair of eyes watching her. She tried to remember what her dad had told her just before she walked on stage. "Just sing for Grandma," he had whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Imagine she's right there in the front row, smiling at you." Angelica tried to picture her grandmother's face, her kind eyes, and the way her nose crinkled when she laughed. But the image was fuzzy, hard to hold on to in the blinding lights and the heavy silence. Out in the audience, her parents were a bundle of nerves. Her father sat with his hands clenched together so tightly that his knuckles were just as white as his daughter's. He stared at the small figure on the giant stage, his chest tight with a mix of pride and a deep, fatherly fear. He just wanted her to be okay, to not be scared. Next to him, her mother was silently praying, her lips moving without making a sound. She had a small, crumpled tissue in her hand, ready for anything, for tears of joy or tears of sadness. They had watched her practice for months, singing her little heart out in their living room. They knew she had a beautiful voice, but they also knew she was just a little girl. A little girl who was currently standing alone in front of thousands of people. Looking smaller and more fragile than ever before, the head judge let out a quiet sigh and leaned forward, finally giving Angelica his full attention. He had seen this scene 100 times. A small child pushed onto a big stage by well-meaning parents, usually to sing a cute song that was far too simple or a difficult song that was far too hard. It rarely ended well. He didn't want to be cruel, but he also didn't have time to waste. He had a long list of contestants to get through, and he was looking for real, raw talent, not just a cute kid in a pretty bow. He looked at the girl, really looked at her. He saw the fear in her wide eyes, the way she was gripping the microphone like a life raft. He felt a small pang of sympathy, but his job was to be a judge. He leaned into his own microphone, and his voice boomed through the huge auditorium, making Angelica jump a little. "All right, young lady," he said. His voice wasn't mean, but it was loud and very clear, a professional voice that was used to being in charge. "What's your name, and what are you going to sing for us today?" He asked the same 2 questions he asked every single contestant. It was part of the routine, a way to get things moving. He picked up his pen, ready to jot down a few notes, already preparing a gentle but firm way to let her down if it wasn't good. He expected a shaky, whispered answer. He expected a song about sunshine or puppies. He expected to be unimpressed. He was just doing his job, getting ready to say next. But as he looked at the small girl taking a deep, shaky breath, he had no idea that in just a few moments, his professional calm and the calm of everyone in that room was about to be completely shattered. The head judge's voice echoed in the giant room, and for a second, Angelica forgot how to breathe. She had to answer him. She had to tell him the song. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat felt like it was full of sand. She took another shaky breath, the kind you take when you're about to jump into a cold pool, and finally, a tiny squeak of a voice came out. I'm going to sing You Are My Sunshine. It wasn't the song she had planned, not the big, difficult ballad her grandmother loved. In that moment of pure panic, her mind had grabbed onto the first song it could find. A simple song she had known since she was a baby. The judge gave a small, almost invisible nod. He wrote something down on his paper, probably something like, "Cute kid, simple song." He looked at the man in the sound booth at the back of the theater and gave another nod. That was the signal. A moment later, the first gentle notes of the song began to play through the big speakers all around the room. The music sounded strange and far away to Angelica, like it was coming from the end of a long tunnel. She knew this music. She had sung it 1,000,000 times. But right now, on this stage, it felt completely new and scary. She lifted the heavy microphone to her lips, her hands trembling so much that the silver stand wobbled a little. She closed her eyes, just like her dad had told her to. She tried to picture her grandmother, but all she could see were the faces in the crowd, a sea of strangers staring at her. She took a deep breath and sang the first line. The sound that came out was not her voice. It was a tiny, thin, shaky thing. It was high and squeaky, like a mouse with a cold. It was also off-key, just a little bit, but enough to make it sound wrong. Very wrong. A cold wave of shock washed over Angelica. That wasn't the voice she heard when she sang in her room. That wasn't the voice her mom said was beautiful. That was a stranger's voice, a broken voice. Her eyes flew open in panic. The music kept playing, sweet and simple, but her voice had ruined it. She tried to keep going. She pushed through to the next line, telling herself to just be louder, to just sing it right. But it was no use. The more she tried, the worse it got. Her voice cracked on the word gray, making it sound like a little croak. She could feel her cheeks getting hot and red. A horrible, prickly feeling started on the back of her neck. She could hear it now, the sound from the audience. It wasn't loud, but it was there. A low murmur like the sound of wind through trees. People were whispering to each other. She saw a woman in the front row shake her head slowly, a look of pity on her face. Angelica's heart was thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt like she was going to be sick. Her hands were so sweaty that the microphone felt slippery, like it was about to fall and crash onto the stage. She wanted to run. She wanted to drop the microphone and run as fast as she could, all the way off the stage and into her mom's arms. But her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. She was trapped. The judges watched her, their faces a mixture of feelings. The lady judge on the end looked truly sad for her, her eyebrows pushed together in a worried frown. The judge on the other end just looked down at his table, doodling on his notepad, completely uninterested. But it was the head judge in the middle whose expression mattered the most. He wasn't being mean, but he was a practical man. He had seen this happen too many times. He saw a little girl who was clearly having a terrible time, a girl who was about to be embarrassed in front of thousands of people. He knew, with absolute certainty, that this was not going to get any better. In his mind, he was doing her a kindness. He was going to put a stop to it before she could feel any worse. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He slowly raised his right hand, his palm facing out toward the stage. It was a simple, clear signal. The man in the sound booth saw it immediately. He knew what it meant. With a quick flick of a switch, he cut the music. 1 second. The room was filled with the gentle tune of You Are My Sunshine. The next second, there was nothing. Just a sudden, shocking, empty silence. The silence was even louder than the music had been. It was a heavy, awful silence that fell on everyone in the theater. Angelica's voice, which had been singing a quiet, shaky note, was now left all alone, hanging in the air for a split second before she choked it off. She stood there, frozen, the microphone still at her lips. Her eyes wide with horror, the head judge leaned into his microphone. His voice soft but carrying all the way to the back of the room. "Sweetheart," he said, his tone gentle, like he was talking to a scared puppy. "That's enough. It's okay." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This is a very big stage, and it can be very scary. There is no shame in this being too much for you. We can stop right now, no hard feelings at all." He gave her what he probably thought was a reassuring smile. The other judges nodded in agreement, thinking he was handling a difficult situation perfectly. They were saving her. They were letting her off the hook, but for Angelica, it was the most embarrassing moment of her entire life. Being told to stop was a million times worse than singing badly. It felt like they were saying she wasn't good enough, that she was a failure. Her face, which had been red before, was now pale. Her bottom lip started to tremble. She could feel the hot tears welling up behind her eyes, and she fought to hold them back. She didn't want to cry on stage. She didn't want all these people to see her cry. She looked out into the dark audience, searching for her parents, but all she could see were blurry shapes. She felt completely and utterly alone, a tiny, failed singer on a giant empty stage. A man in a black shirt, a stagehand, started to walk slowly toward her from the side of the stage, ready to lead her away into the wings. It was over. The world had shrunk to the size of a single, horrifying spotlight. In that light stood Angelica, a small statue of failure. The silence in the auditorium was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to stand up straight. The stagehand was getting closer. He was a big man in a black t-shirt, and he moved with a slow, steady purpose that was somehow more terrifying than if he had run. Each step he took on the wooden floor was a soft thump that echoed in Angelica's ears, marking the end of her dream. He was coming to take her away. He was coming to turn off the microphone and lead her into the darkness, off the stage, where everyone would forget about her in 5 minutes. Her vision started to get blurry. The hot tears she had been fighting so hard to hold back were winning the battle. One escaped, tracing a hot, salty path down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away with the back of her hand, angry at herself. Crying was for babies. She was 7 years old. She was supposed to be brave, but she didn't feel brave. She felt small and stupid and completely broken. Her throat ached, not from singing, but from the huge, painful lump that had formed there. She wanted her mom. She wanted to go home. She wanted to wake up and realize this was all a terrible nightmare. The stagehand was only a few feet away now. He had a kind face, but it didn't matter. He was the symbol of her defeat. In a few seconds, his hand would be on her shoulder, and it would be over. The judges would move on to the next person. The audience would clap politely because they felt sorry for her. And she would be just another memory of a kid who couldn't handle the pressure. But then something strange happened. As the stagehand reached out his hand, a different image flashed into Angelica's mind. It wasn't the stage or the judges or the thousands of people. It was her grandmother's living room. The sun was streaming through the window, making little dust motes dance in the air like tiny fairies. Her grandmother was sitting in her old, soft armchair, a blanket over her legs, her hands clasped together. She was smiling, her eyes crinkling at the corners the way they always did when she was happy. Angelica was standing on a little wooden stool, singing into a hairbrush, pretending it was a real microphone. She was singing the same song, the big ballad, the one her grandmother loved more than any other. "You have an old soul, Angie," her grandmother had said, her voice a little weak but full of love. "And a voice that comes straight from the heart. Don't you ever let anyone tell you any different? You promise me you'll keep singing?" And Angelica, standing on that wobbly stool, had promised. "I promise, Grandma. I'll sing for you always." That memory hit her with the force of a tidal wave. It was so real, so vivid. She could almost smell her grandmother's perfume, a soft, flowery scent that always made her feel safe. Her grandmother wasn't here anymore. She had gone to a place where you couldn't see her, but Angelica knew she was still watching. She was watching right now. And what would she think? She would see her granddaughter giving up. She would see her breaking her promise. A new feeling started to bubble up inside Angelica's chest. It was small at first, like a tiny spark, but it grew quickly, pushing against the sadness and the shame. It was a feeling of defiance. It was a feeling of love. It was the promise she had made. The stagehand's fingers were just inches from her shoulder. This was her last chance. If she didn't speak now, she never would. She didn't think. She just acted. She took a tiny step back, away from the stagehand's outstretched hand. She looked up, not at the judges, but at the dark, empty space above them, as if she was looking at someone only she could see. She opened her mouth and a sound came out. It wasn't a song. It was a single word, whispered so quietly that at first no one heard it. Please. The stagehand stopped, his hand frozen in mid-air. The judges, who had already started talking amongst themselves, fell silent. The audience, which had been buzzing with quiet chatter, also went quiet. That one small word had cut through all the noise like a knife. Angelica swallowed hard. The lump in her throat still there, but a little smaller now. She looked down at the stage, at her scuffed black shoes, and spoke again, a little louder this time. Her voice was shaky, but it was clear. Please, she said again. Just one more chance. The head judge leaned forward, a surprised look on his face. He hadn't expected this. He had expected tears, he had expected her to run, but he hadn't expected this quiet, polite plea. Young lady, he started to say, his tone gentle but firm. I think it's best if we... But Angelica interrupted him. She didn't mean to be rude, but the words were pouring out of her now, fueled by the memory of her grandmother and the promise she had to keep. She lifted her head and looked directly at the head judge for the first time since the music stopped. Her eyes were shiny with unshed tears, but they were also filled with a fire that hadn't been there before. I have to do this, she said, her voice stronger now. I have to. It's for my grandma. The mention of her grandmother hung in the air, heavy and full of meaning. It changed everything. The audience didn't see a failed contestant anymore. They saw a little girl who was fighting for something much bigger than a talent show. In the front row, Angelica's mother let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Her father put a strong arm around her, his own eyes glistening. He knew exactly what his daughter was talking about. The judges were silent. The head judge stared at Angelica, his professional mask completely gone. He was just a man now, looking at a little girl who had just bared her soul. He saw the determination in her eyes, the slight tremble in her chin. He thought about his own grandmother, about the promises he had made and broken as a child. This wasn't about talent anymore. This was about heart. He had been ready to dismiss her, to send her on her way for her own good. But now he wasn't so sure. He looked at the lady judge next to him. She had tears in her eyes and she gave him a small, almost invisible nod. The other judge, who had looked so bored before, was now sitting up straight, watching Angelica with a look of deep respect. The head judge took a deep breath. He was a professional. He had a show to run, but he was also a human being. He looked back at the small, determined girl standing in the middle of the vast stage. She wasn't asking to win. She was just asking to sing. He thought about the power of a promise, especially a promise made to someone you love. He had seen countless performers, full of arrogance and confidence, but he had never seen anything like this. This was real. He slowly leaned back into his microphone. The entire auditorium held its breath, waiting for his decision. He looked at Angelica, a genuine, warm smile spreading across his face for the first time that day. Okay, Angelica, he said, his voice soft but clear, filled with a new kind of respect. Okay, one more time. For your grandma? He turned his head and gave a sharp, decisive nod to the sound booth at the back of the theater. The stagehand, understanding, quietly stepped back into the shadows of the wings. Angelica closed her eyes, took a deep, steadying breath, and held the microphone with a new kind of strength. She wasn't holding it like a heavy burden anymore. She was holding it like a gift. And as the first notes of her song began to play for the second time, everyone in the room knew that something was about to be different. The music started again. It was the same melody, the same gentle opening notes of the big, difficult ballad her grandmother had adored. But this time, it didn't sound strange or far away. This time, as the notes floated through the vast auditorium, they felt like they were coming from inside her own heart. They felt like home. Angelica closed her eyes. She didn't just squeeze them shut. She let them drift closed, slowly and peacefully. The blinding lights, the intimidating judges, the thousands of unseen faces, they all melted away. The stage beneath her feet was no longer hard, polished wood. It was the soft, worn carpet of her grandmother's living room. She was no longer standing alone in a spotlight. She was standing on her little wooden stool, and she could almost feel the gentle, loving presence of her grandmother sitting right there in her old armchair. Watching her with a proud, warm smile, she wasn't singing for the judges anymore. She wasn't singing for the audience or for the big prize. She was singing for her. She was keeping her promise when she opened her mouth to sing. The voice that came out was not the voice of a scared 7-year-old. It was not the thin, shaky squeak from moments before. It was a voice that seemed impossible, a voice that belonged to someone who had lived 100 years and felt every joy and every sorrow the world had to offer. It was rich and pure and clear, like a perfect bell ringing on a quiet morning. It flowed out of her, smooth and effortless, and filled every corner of the giant theater. The first line of the song hung in the air, and the entire auditorium gasped. It was a collective, involuntary intake of breath, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. The man in the sound booth, who had heard thousands of voices, froze with his hand hovering over a slider. The stagehand, who had been waiting in the wings, peeked his head out, his eyes wide with disbelief. The judges were completely transformed. The head judge, the man with the tired eyes and the professional calm, was staring as if he had just seen a ghost. His pen, which had been tapping a moment ago, had slipped from his fingers and lay forgotten on the table. His jaw was literally hanging open, his mouth a perfect O of astonishment. He had come to work that day expecting to judge a talent show. Instead, he was witnessing a miracle. He wasn't hearing a child sing. He was hearing a soul pour itself out through music. The lady judge on the end was no longer just looking sad or sympathetic. Tears were now streaming freely down her cheeks, silent rivers of emotion. She wasn't even trying to wipe them away. She just stared at the little girl on stage, her hand pressed to her heart as if to keep it from breaking with the sheer beauty of what she was hearing. The third judge, the one who had been so bored he was doodling, was now sitting bolt upright in his chair. He had pushed his notepad aside and was leaning forward, his elbows on the table, his entire being focused on the small figure on the stage. The cynical look on his face had been replaced by one of pure, unmasked awe. As Angelica sang, her voice grew stronger and more confident. She wasn't just hitting the notes, she was living inside them. Every word was filled with a deep, heartfelt meaning. When the song spoke of love, her voice was warm and tender. When it spoke of loss, her voice held a haunting, beautiful sadness that made the heart ache. It was a voice that had stories to tell, a voice that had known pain and had found a way to turn it into something beautiful out in the audience. A profound silence had fallen. It wasn't the heavy, awkward silence from before. This was a sacred, reverent silence. No one whispered. No one moved. People were holding their breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might break the spell. A big, tough-looking man with a beard, who had probably come to the show expecting a bit of fun, was discreetly wiping a tear from the corner of his eye. A teenage girl, who had been scrolling on her phone when Angelica first walked on stage, was now staring, her phone forgotten in her lap, her mouth slightly agape. Angelica's parents were clinging to each other, their bodies shaking with silent, overwhelming sobs of pride and wonder. They knew their daughter could sing, but they had never heard anything like this. This was something else entirely. The song began to build, rising towards its powerful climax. The music swelled and Angelica's voice rose with it, soaring higher and higher, filling the vast space with a sound so magnificent it seemed to touch the very ceiling. She sang a long, difficult note that most professional singers would struggle to hit. She held it, not with effort, but with a breathtaking control that seemed to defy her age and her small stature. It was a note of pure, unblemished perfection, a sound that seemed to transcend time and space. In that moment, she was not a 7-year-old girl on a stage. She was a conduit for something pure and magical. She was the embodiment of love and memory, a living tribute to the grandmother she adored. And everyone in that room, every single person, felt it. They were no longer just an audience. They were a part of her story, a part of her promise. Then, as the music began to soften, her voice softened with it, gently guiding the song to its end. She sang the final line, a simple, quiet declaration of love. And then she held the last note. It wasn't a loud or showy note. It was a single, pure, clear tone that she held with incredible steadiness. It hung in the air like a perfect, shimmering bubble, delicate and beautiful. For what felt like an eternity, no one in the auditorium breathed. They just listened to that one perfect note, a sound that seemed to contain all the love in the world. Finally, the note faded into silence. The music ended. And for 3 full seconds, the room was completely, utterly silent. It was a silence filled with so much emotion, so much shock and wonder, that it was more powerful than any noise. Then, the world exploded. It started with one person. A single person leaping to their feet and clapping loudly. Then another and another, until a wave of sound and motion crashed through the entire auditorium. The whole audience, every single person, was on their feet. The sound was deafening, a thunderous, roaring ovation that shook the very foundations of the building. People were cheering, shouting, "Bravo!" and crying all at once. The sound was a physical force, a tidal wave of love and appreciation that washed over the stage. Angelica, who had been lost in her own world, slowly opened her eyes. The silence was gone, replaced by a wall of sound. She blinked, her eyes adjusting to the light. She saw the thousands of people, no longer blurry shapes, but distinct individuals, all standing, all clapping for her. A look of pure, innocent surprise spread across her face. She looked down at her hands, as if wondering where all that beautiful sound had come from. Then a small, shy smile touched her lips. She had done it. She had kept her promise. And in doing so, she had left an entire world of people completely and utterly speechless. The sound was a living thing. It wasn't just noise. It was a giant, warm wave made of thousands of hands clapping and thousands of voices cheering all at once. It crashed over Angelica, who stood frozen in the middle of the stage, her small hands still holding the microphone. For a moment, she looked like a little bird caught in a hurricane, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and wonder. The blur of faces in the audience was no longer just a blur. She could see them now, men and women, young and old, all on their feet, their faces turned up to her, many with tears streaming down their cheeks. They were smiling. They were clapping for her. A slow, shy smile spread across her own face. It wasn't a big, showy smile. It was a small, private thing, a secret between her and the memory of her grandmother. She had done it. She had really done it. She lowered the microphone from her lips and just stood there for a moment, soaking it all in. She gave a small, almost clumsy curtsy, the way her mother had taught her, and the crowd roared even louder. It was the most wonderful, most terrifying, most amazing sound she had ever heard. On the judges' table, there was chaos. The head judge was still staring, his mouth slightly agape, as if his brain was trying to catch up with what his ears had just heard. He looked down at his hands, then back at the little girl, a look of complete disbelief on his face. He had been a judge for a long, long time. He had heard professionals, celebrities, and prodigies. He had thought he had heard it all. But this was something else. This was a once-in-a-lifetime moment. He picked up his pen, then put it down again, realizing that no words he could write would ever be enough. The lady judge had finally found a tissue and was dabbing at her eyes, but a fresh wave of tears kept coming. She looked at the head judge and just shook her head, unable to speak. The third judge, the one who had been so disinterested, was now on his feet, clapping along with the audience, a huge, genuine grin on his face. He looked like a kid who had just seen his favorite superhero in real life. The head judge took a deep breath and leaned into his microphone. The audience, sensing he was about to speak, began to quiet down, their applause softening to a low, expectant hum. He cleared his throat, a strange, unfamiliar sound in the now quiet room. He looked at Angelica, and when he spoke, his voice was different. It wasn't the loud, professional voice from before. It was soft, a little shaky, and filled with a raw, honest emotion that everyone in the room could feel. I have no words, he began, and he let out a short, incredulous laugh. Honestly, for the first time in my career, I am completely and utterly speechless. He paused, looking out at the audience, then back at Angelica. When we first started, I was concerned. I thought this stage was too big for you. I thought I was doing you a kindness by stopping you. He shook his head slowly, a look of regret on his face. I was so wrong. I have never been more wrong in my entire life. The audience applauded again, a short, supportive burst of sound. The judge held up his hand, asking for quiet. What we just heard, he continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction, was not just a performance. That was not just a little girl singing a song. That was a gift. An absolute gift from heaven. You have a voice that is not of this world, but more importantly, you have a heart that is bigger than this entire building. You took all of us on a journey with you. You made us feel something. And that, young lady, is the true magic of music. He looked at the other judges who were nodding enthusiastically. There is no discussion here. There is no debate. It is an absolute, resounding yes from me. He slammed his hand down on his big red button, and the yes sign lit up behind him. The lady judge followed immediately, her yes sign lighting up as she blew a kiss toward the stage. The third judge was right behind them, his yes sign joining the others. The stage was now lit up with 3 bright, glowing affirmations. Angelica's parents were no longer in their seats. As soon as the final yes lit up, her father had swept her mother into a huge, tight hug, both of them crying openly. They held each other, their bodies shaking with a mixture of relief, pride, and overwhelming joy. They had watched their little girl face her biggest fear and turn it into the most beautiful moment of their lives. They had no idea what would happen next, but in that moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was the shining light of their daughter, standing tall and proud on that stage. In the days that followed, the world got to share in that moment. A clip of the performance, uploaded to the internet, spread like wildfire. It started with a simple title, "The Moment a 7-Year-Old Silenced a Nation." Within hours, it had millions of views. By the next day, it was being talked about on every news channel and shared across every social media platform. People couldn't get enough of it. They were captivated not just by the incredible voice, but by the story, the scared little girl who was given a second chance and used it to touch the hearts of millions. The clip of the judge's speech, his honest admission of being wrong, was shared just as much as the song itself. It was a story of hope, of courage, and of the incredible power of a promise. A few days later, a reporter sat down with Angelica and her parents for a short interview. Angelica, now more comfortable in front of a camera, held a small framed picture of her grandmother in her lap. "Angelica," the reporter asked gently, "that performance was for your grandmother, isn't that right?" Angelica nodded, her little finger tracing the outline of her grandmother's face in the picture. "Yes," she said softly. "She passed away a little while ago. But before she did, she made me promise to always keep singing. She said my voice was a gift and I shouldn't be scared to share it." She looked up at the reporter, her eyes clear and serious. "On the stage, I was really scared. I forgot my promise. But when they tried to stop me, I remembered. I had to sing for her. I had to keep my promise." The story of the promise became the heart of the viral sensation. It wasn't just about a talented kid anymore. It was about love, loss, and the beautiful ways we keep the memory of our loved ones alive. Angelica became an overnight sensation, receiving invitations to sing on television shows and at special events. But for her, the biggest victory had already happened. That evening, after all the excitement had died down, Angelica sat in her grandmother's old armchair. The house was quiet. She held the picture of her grandmother in her hands, the same one from the interview. She looked at the kind, smiling face, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest. She had sung for the judges, for the audience, for the whole world. But she knew deep down that there had only ever been one person in that audience who truly mattered. And she knew, with a certainty that filled her with a quiet, lasting peace, that her grandmother had heard every single note. She had kept her promise, and in doing so had found her own voice, a voice that was now ready to sing for the whole world.